I have taught at the university for nearly 20 years that in that time, I've seen every type of student imaginable, the brilliant ones who barely try, the quiet ones who surprise you at the end of the semester, and the ones who arrive late, careless, convinced the world owes them something, but none frustrated me quite like Daniel that he always sat in the back row, every morning at exactly 8:10 late. Hair messy. Eyes half closed. Hoodie pulled over his head like sunlight was his enemy, and most mornings, he looked drunk. The first time I noticed him, he walked into class rubbing his temples. "Professor," he muttered, voice rough, "the lights, could you dim them?" The lecture hall lights were already low. "No," I replied. "You're in a classroom, not a bar at closing time." A few students laughed. Daniel didn't. That he just sat down slowly and pressed his fingers against his forehead like someone trying to hold his skull together. 10 minutes later he ran out of the room. That I assumed he had gone to throw up. The pattern repeated, again, and again, and again. Some mornings he looked pale. Other mornings he leaned over his desk like the world was spinning. Sometimes he whispered complaints. "My head, too bright, I feel sick." To me it was obvious. Hangovers, every professor has seen them. College life. Parties. Bad decisions, and frankly, I was tired of it. One morning I stopped mid-lecture and pointed directly at him. "Daniel," I said. The room fell silent. "If you plan to continue showing up intoxicated, you might consider choosing another class." The students shifted uncomfortably. Daniel looked up slowly. For a second I thought he might argue. Instead he said quietly, "I'm not drunk." Then he lowered his head again. That answer irritated me more than anything else. Not drunk? Then what was it? Because the symptoms were textbook: headache, light sensitivity, nausea, fatigue, classic hangover. But he kept coming back, every class, never missing one. Just suffering through it. Update. 2 months later nothing had improved. If anything, it had become worse. Daniel now spent half the lecture with his head resting on his arms. Sometimes he would suddenly stand up and rush out of the classroom, pale and shaking. Students had started whispering about him. Probably drinks all night. Maybe drugs. Why doesn't the professor do something? Eventually I decided they were right, that it was time to do something. One cold Monday morning he stumbled into class looking worse than ever. His face was ghost white, dark circles under his eyes, his hands trembled slightly as he sat down. 10 minutes into the lecture he stood abruptly. He didn't finish the sentence. That he collapsed back into the chair. "That was enough, Daniel," I said sharply. "Come with me." The entire room watched as I led him out into the hallway. We walked straight to the director's office. Daniel moved slowly, one hand pressed against the wall for balance. I interpreted it as guilt. The director, Dr. Almeida, looked up as we entered. "Yes?" I crossed my arms. "I believe this student has been attending my class intoxicated for the past 2 months. Daniel looked down at the floor. Dr. Almeida sighed. "Daniel, this is a serious accusation." The boy swallowed hard. "I told you. I'm not drunk." His voice was barely above a whisper. My patient snapped, then explained the constant nausea. The headaches. The way you can barely stand up some mornings. Silence filled the office. For a moment I thought he would finally admit it. Instead, he reached slowly into his backpack and pulled out an envelope. "I was going to give this to the administration today," he said. His hands shook as he passed it to the director. Dr. Almeida opened it. His expression changed instantly, first confusion, then shock, then something I had not expected, concern. He handed the document to me. "Professor, you should read this." The medical report was short, but it hit like a thunderclap. Neurological evaluation, severe chronic migraine disorder, photophobia, persistent headaches, nausea, dizziness, episodes triggered by light exposure and stress, and a final note: patient continues attending university despite daily symptoms. I looked up slowly. Daniel was standing there quietly, not defensive, not angry, just tired. "So, you're not drunk?" I said quietly. He shook his head. "No." "Then why didn't you explain this earlier?" He hesitated before answering. "Because most people assume I'm making excuses." The room felt very small suddenly. For 2 months I had watched him struggle. 2 months I had believed the worst. 2 months I had mistaken endurance for irresponsibility. I closed the folder slowly. "How long have you had this?" "Since I was 16. "And you still come to class every morning?" He nodded. "I want to graduate." Not a complaint, not a defense, just a simple truth. That afternoon I returned to my classroom and looked at the empty back row. For years I believed experience made me a good judge of people, but sometimes, what looks like weakness is actually someone fighting a battle you cannot see, and sometimes the quiet student in the back row is the strongest person in the room. Graduation cap.